Title: The HOA Tyrant and the Judge. Oakhaven Estates was supposed to be the kind of place where people could enjoy a peaceful, suburban life. It had charming homes, manicured lawns, and a seemingly close-knit community. But beneath the surface, it was a dictatorship, one ruled by the iron fist of Karen Wilkins. Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She was its self-proclaimed queen. With her ever-present clipboard and an army of snitches, she dictated everything from the height of hedges to the color of front doors. If a homeowner so much as left their trash cans out for too long, they would find themselves slapped with a hefty fine or, worse, publicly shamed in the neighborhood newsletter. For years, no one dared to challenge her. Then came Daniel Carter. A quiet man in his early 60s, Daniel had recently retired and moved into Oakhaven Estates for a peaceful life. He didn't brag about his past, didn't go out of his way to meet every neighbor, and, most egregiously, didn't grovel before Karen. He simply went about his life, tending to his garden and enjoying the tranquility of his new home. Karen despised him instantly. Something about the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the lack of concern for her authority, made her blood boil. So she did what she did best. She made his life hell. The first confrontation happened on a crisp Saturday morning. Karen marched up to Daniel's home, clipboard in hand, and rapped sharply on his door. Daniel opened it, his expression calm but mildly curious. "Good morning," he said politely. Karen didn't return the courtesy. She pointed at his mailbox with her pen. "This mailbox is not in compliance with HOA standards." Daniel glanced at it. It was sturdy, well-maintained, and painted in a neutral color that matched his home. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked evenly. "It's not the correct shade of brown." Karen snapped, flipping through her notes. Daniel frowned and studied the HOA guidelines. Then he looked at his mailbox again. They were identical. "I believe this shade is within regulations," he said. Karen's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to pushback. Most homeowners either rolled over or begged her not to issue a violation. "I make the final decisions on compliance," she huffed. Daniel sighed. "That's interesting because, from my understanding, HOA presidents don't have unilateral authority. The rules are set by the board and require proper voting procedures." Karen bristled. From that moment on, Daniel Carter was enemy number one. The first fine was for his mailbox. Then came another for his lawn. Apparently, his grass was half an inch too high. Then his garden hose was deemed unsightly. Then his car was parked too far to the left in his own driveway. Each time, Daniel responded calmly, citing the HOA laws and proving Karen wrong. He even offered to discuss the issues at an HOA meeting, which only made her angrier. Determined to make him fold, Karen called a special meeting titled, "Addressing a Homeowner Who Refuses to Follow the Rules." Daniel attended, dressed neatly in a button-up shirt and slacks. Karen, flanked by her most loyal board members, launched into a speech about how some people thought they were above the rules. "We need to set an example," she declared, glaring at Daniel. "If we don't enforce regulations, this neighborhood will fall apart." Daniel let her finish. Then he stood up and spoke in a measured tone. "Madam President, may I ask a few questions?" Karen smirked. "Oh, now you care about the rules." "I always have," Daniel replied smoothly. "Which is why I took the liberty of reviewing the HOA charter." He pulled out a well-worn booklet and opened it to a specific page. "It states here that all HOA enforcement actions require a board vote. I see no record of any vote regarding the fines issued against me. That would mean these fines are, in fact, illegal." The room went silent. Karen froze. Furthermore, Daniel continued, Section 4.3 states that board members cannot single-handedly create new regulations without proper homeowner input. "So these new rules you introduced last month? Those are void as well." Karen's smug look vanished. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few neighbors whispered among themselves. For the first time in years, Karen felt control slipping through her fingers. She stormed out of the meeting, humiliated, but more determined than ever. If Daniel Carter wanted a war, she'd give him one. That night, Karen sat in her home, sipping cheap wine and scrolling through the HOA guidelines. Rage burned inside her. If she couldn't beat Daniel Carter with the rules, she'd bend them. The next morning, the real war began. Karen summoned her most loyal HOA enforcers, a small group of nosy, power-hungry board members who thrived on control. "We need to get rid of this man," Karen declared, tapping her clipboard. He's a menace to our authority. Her right-hand woman, Marge, nodded furiously. The way he spoke to you was completely disrespectful. I know, Karen said dramatically. He's undermining everything we've built. Of course, what they had built was nothing more than a glorified extortion scheme. Karen used nonsense fines to keep homeowners in constant fear of the HOA. Most people paid just to avoid confrontation. But Daniel Carter wasn't like most people. Over the next week, Karen flooded Daniel with violation notices. His fence was suddenly too high. His security cameras were deemed an unauthorized structure. His outdoor lighting was too bright. Each time, Daniel responded with legal citations proving her wrong. Karen was furious. He's mocking me, she fumed, throwing one of his response letters onto her desk. He's treating this like a game. Marge leaned in. If the rules won't work, maybe we should call in the real authorities. Karen's lips curled into a sinister smile. Now that's an idea. The next day, Karen picked up her phone and dialed 911. Yes, I need to report an illegal structure in our neighborhood, she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. A resident has built something dangerous, and it's a hazard. The dispatcher asked for details, and Karen exaggerated wildly. It's some kind of massive gazebo structure, she claimed. It's unstable, and it could collapse at any moment. There are children in the area. It's a serious safety risk. Within 30 minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of Daniel's house. Karen watched from her window, giddy with anticipation. This was it. The police would force Daniel to tear down whatever nonsense he had built, and she would finally have the upper hand. Daniel opened the door, completely unbothered as the officer explained why they were there. He simply nodded, then gestured for them to follow him to the backyard. Karen held her breath. Any second now, the police would shut him down. But then the officer laughed. Karen's eyes widened in horror. The officer shook his head and patted Daniel on the back. Sir, I have no idea why someone called this in. This gazebo is perfectly legal and solidly built. In fact, it's nicer than the one at my own house. Daniel chuckled. Would you like to see the official permits? The officer smiled. Not necessary, sir. Sorry to bother you. Karen watched in horror as the officer walked back to his car, shaking his head. Then, just to twist the knife, Daniel turned and gave Karen a polite wave. Karen slammed the blinds shut. She had never been so embarrassed. This isn't over, she growled. She called an emergency HOA board meeting that night. We need to go deeper, she said, pacing in front of them. This man is dangerous. He's manipulative, and we need to stop him before he completely undermines our authority. One of the board members hesitated. But he hasn't actually done anything wrong. Karen whipped around, eyes blazing. Are you on my side or his? The man shrank back. I'm just saying we should be careful. Karen ignored him. I want dirt on him. I don't care what it is. I want to know where he works, what his past is, anything we can use against him. Marge, her most loyal ally, smirked. I might know someone who can dig up some details. Karen's lips curled. Perfect. A few days later, Karen received an envelope in her mailbox. It had no return address, just a neatly typed letter. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words. Mrs. Wilkins, I would advise you to be very careful about weaponizing the law. It tends to bite back. I suggest you cease your actions before this escalates further. Some of us know exactly how the legal system works. Some of us also know exactly how to make sure it works against those who abuse it. Consider this your only warning. Karen's hands trembled as she read the letter. Her eyes darted to her security cameras. She rewound the footage. No one had dropped off the letter. How did he get it in her mailbox without being seen? A chill ran down her spine. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. You want war, Judge Carter? She muttered, crumpling the letter. You got one. Determined to destroy Daniel, Karen took things too far. She ordered the HO maintenance team to perform an emergency inspection of Daniel's property while he was away. At 10 a.m., 2 HOA workers arrived. They hopped the fence, claiming it was an official HOA inspection. They snapped photos, rifled through his backyard, and even tried to peek inside his garage windows. They didn't notice the hidden security cameras recording their every move. By the time they left, they thought they had won. But what they didn't know was that Daniel was watching it all live from his phone. He smiled coldly as he zoomed in on their faces. That's breaking and entering, Karen, he murmured to himself. And I think it's time you learn what happens when you mess with the law. The next morning, Daniel Carter sat in his study, sipping coffee as he drafted a legal document. He wasn't just preparing a response, he was preparing a counterattack. By noon, a process server arrived at Karen Wilkins' door with an official envelope. Mrs. Wilkins. Karen, still feeling smug from her so-called inspection of Daniel's property, gave the man an irritated look. What? You've been served. She grabbed the envelope, ripped it open, and began to read. Her face turned pale. Daniel Carter was suing her for harassment, trespassing, and abuse of power. The HOA was named in the lawsuit, too. She sank onto her porch step, gripping the papers with trembling hands. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And it was just the beginning. The HOA board was in chaos. Karen had gathered them for an emergency meeting, her voice shrill as she slammed the lawsuit on the table. He's suing us. This is an attack on our authority. We have to fight back. Richard, one of the more level-headed board members, adjusted his glasses and picked up the document. His expression darkened as he read. Karen, he said slowly, do you realize what you've done? I did what was necessary, she shot back. We had to take control. Richard exhaled sharply. You ordered an illegal inspection. You had our workers jump a fence and trespass on private property. Daniel has all of it on camera. Marge, Karen's closest ally, frowned. Can we, delete the footage? Richard's glare could have melted steel. Do you want to add evidence tampering to the list of crimes? Silence. Karen clenched her jaw. So what do we do? Richard put the lawsuit down. Settle. Immediately. Karen refused to accept it. No. If we settle, it means we're guilty. We have to countersue. Richard rubbed his temples. For what, Karen? He's a retired judge. He knows the law better than anyone in this room. And in case you didn't notice, the lawsuit isn't just against you. It's against the HOA itself. Karen paled. So, Richard continued, we have two options. One, we fight this in court and lose everything, because let's be honest, we will lose. Or two, we settle and hope Daniel doesn't completely destroy us. Marge shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should listen to Richard. Karen slammed her fist on the table. No, I won't be humiliated. But the humiliation was already knocking at her door. Daniel Carter didn't stop at filing the lawsuit. He made sure the local news found out about it, too. The next morning, Oakhaven Estates was buzzing. Neighbors were passing around copies of the newspaper. The headline read, Homeowners Association sued for harassment and trespassing. Karen's name was all over it. By noon, homeowners started coming forward with their own horror stories. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man down the street, revealed how Karen fined him $500 for having a garden gnome in the wrong spot. The Johnsons, a young couple, admitted she tried to have their dog removed for being too loud, even though their dog was deaf. Mrs. Lopez, a widow, told how Karen forced her to repaint her house 3 times in 1 year because the colors weren't subtle enough. People were furious. Then came the final blow. A financial audit of the HOA revealed that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Expensive lunches. Unapproved home repairs. Even a weekend getaway is labeled as a community retreat. By the end of the week, the board members were left with no choice. They voted. Karen Wilkins was officially removed as HOA president. 2 weeks later, Karen found herself sitting in a courtroom, hands clenched in her lap as the judge called the case. Daniel sat across from her, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. The judge didn't look amused. Mrs. Wilkins, he began, adjusting his glasses, it appears you have been using the HOA as a personal weapon to harass a homeowner. Furthermore, the evidence clearly shows that you authorized an unlawful entry into private property. Karen tried to speak. Your Honor, I. Be quiet, Mrs. Wilkins. She flinched. Your actions are not just unethical, the judge continued. They are criminals. And considering that the homeowner you targeted happens to be a retired federal judge, I imagine you're starting to understand just how serious this is. Karen's face drained of color. Daniel watched silently, his hands folded on the table. The judge flipped through the case file. Now, you have 2 choices. 1, you plead guilty to harassment, trespassing, and abuse of authority, and accept the penalties that come with it. Or 2, we take this to trial, where I assure you the consequences will be much worse. Karen's heart pounded. A trial against a federal judge? She had lost. Completely. Her reign as HOA queen was over. She swallowed hard. I plead guilty, Your Honor. Daniel's lips curled into the faintest smile. The judge nodded. Wise decision. By the end of the week, Karen was ordered to pay thousands in fines and damages, not just to Daniel, but to other homeowners she had wronged. The HOA dissolved. And Karen? She lost everything. With no job, no power, and a criminal record, Karen had no choice but to sell her house. The once mighty ruler of Oakhaven Estates was forced to move into a tiny apartment on the other side of town. Then one day, Daniel Carter walked into a local department store. As he browsed the aisles, a familiar voice rang out. Would you like to sign up for our store rewards program? Daniel turned slowly. Standing there in a cheap red uniform was Karen. Her eyes widened in horror as she recognized him. For a long, tense moment, they just stared at each other. Then Daniel smiled. Not smug, not cruel, just polite. No, thank you, he said pleasantly before walking away. Karen stood there, paralyzed as the reality of her new life sank in. She had once ruled a neighborhood. Now she was just another cashier in a store where she had no control. And the best part? Her new boss was just as petty and strict as she had once been. Justice was served.